Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Saturday, February 22nd, day 505 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our military reporter, Emmanuel Fabian. Hi, Manny. Thanks for joining me on this special hostage release update.
Hi, Amanda. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. 6 Israeli men were returned home today from Gaza. In the first release from southern Gaza's Rafah was Avera Mengistu, who spent 3,821 days in Hamas captivity, and Tal Shoham, who was captured on October 7th, 2023. Later in the day from Nuseirat, Omer Shem Tov, Omer Wenkert, and Eliya Cohen were released, each spending 505 days in indescribable conditions. And finally, later in the afternoon, Israeli Bedouin Hisham al-Sayed, who has been in Hamas captivity since April 2015, was set to be released in Gaza City. We'll discuss all of this and more after the break. Manny, before we dive into today's 6 released hostages, we are updating listeners that the body of Shiri Bibas was returned to Israel late last night and identified. The confirmation of Shiri's death means that 3 generations of her family were murdered by terrorists. Her parents, Yossi and Margit Silberman, were killed at Kibbutz Nir Oz on October 7th, 2023, during the attack. And Shiri and her sons, Ariel and Kfir, were murdered in captivity. So, Manny, what can you tell us about the identification process this time around?
So this comes after what Hamas has called a mix-up, when on Thursday it released the body of what turned out to be a Gazan woman and not Shiri Bibas, along with the bodies of her 2 young children. Late last night, it was a bit of a surprise that Hamas was so quick with this, but it called the Red Cross to a certain site in Gaza. The Red Cross collected the body and brought it to Israeli forces, and then it was escorted out of Gaza and taken to the Abu Kabir Forensic Institute. This is very late Friday night. The Forensic Institute's not normally running. They had to call people from their homes, the specialists there, to come back to the facility to try and identify the body. And a couple hours later, I think it was around 4 or 5 in the morning, the body was identified as belonging to Shiri Bibas, and the family, the remaining members of the family, of course, Yarden Bibas, the husband, was notified. According to assessments by Israel, according to the intelligence and as well as the report now that's come from Abu Kabir, is that Shiri was also murdered in captivity in November 2023, so several weeks into the war, along with her 2 children, Ariel and Kfir. They were all killed at the same time by their captors. And then, of course, later Hamas would claim that they were killed in an airstrike, but Israel denies that that is the case.
We should mention that Yarden, the father, Shiri's husband, has requested that the world know that his family was murdered. He's also requested that we don't go into too much detail. So let's turn to happier news now, Manny. And today makes 30 living hostages who have returned home from Gaza in the first phase of the mediated ceasefire-hostage release deal. This is phase 1. Again, we don't know yet about phase 2. And this morning, just before 10 a.m., 2 hostages were released, Avera Mengistu and Tal Shoham. So tell us what you saw when they came out of the Hamas cars. What is their health status? How did they look today?
What we saw is Hamas's usual parade that it does on a stage. This time it was in Rafah, in the Strip South. It's the first time they've released hostages from there in this ceasefire. And both appeared to be in relatively okay health. There didn't seem to be anything particularly unusual, but of course there's a lot that goes on underneath that is only found out much later. We've seen from all the previous hostage releases that just because hostages are walking and smiling and waving does not mean that everything is actually okay inside as well. So they have since been brought out of Gaza, of course. Tal Shoham was in there for 505 days, and Avera Mengistu was there for nearly 4,000 days. He's been there for over a decade. So there's going to be a lot of attention now towards them in the hospitals to check that everything's okay. Who knows what they've been through during that time, but it's safe to say that they were brought out of Gaza to an army facility near the border, not immediately rushed to hospital. They met with family members and then they were taken to hospitals afterwards. So that indicates that there isn't anything immediate that needs looking at, but we'll know in time exactly what their conditions are.
Just to remind our listeners, Tal was snatched from the home of his wife Adi's parents in Kibbutz Be'eri on October 7th. And Adi's father and uncle were murdered. Adi and the couple's younger children, Naveh and Yahel, were released during the week-long truce and hostage deal in November 2023. There has been no sign of life, apparently, from Tal since October 7th, 2023. So this is, of course, a very emotional day for that family that has suffered so much. And as you said, Avera Mengistu, he's 38, and according to his family and Israeli officials, Mengistu crossed into the northern Gaza border from the beach at Zikim on September 2014, a very unusual case. We'll hear a similar case a little later in the program. Now, later in the day, about 12:30 today, 3 additional Israeli men, Omer Shem Tov, Omer Wenkert, and Eliya Cohen, were also released into the hands of the International Red Cross. And what was, for me, really startling in this particular ceremony was to see the smiling, waving master showman, Omer Shem Tov, who was kissing the heads of his masked Hamas captors. And it was so obviously an apparent staged act to show how great the relations were between the captors and their emaciated hostages. So, Manny, what do you know about the status of Omer Shem Tov and the 2 other men right now?
From what we understand, they are in similar condition to the other hostages. Of course, they look very pale and thin, but they haven't been rushed immediately to hospital. So that does tell us that relatively they're in okay health condition. We did, of course, see them smiling and waving at the ceremony. And like you mentioned, he was, of course, forced or told to by Hamas to kiss the forehead of one of the terrorists standing on the stage. Hamas does this whole act every time they do the releases, and it's not an exception this time. But it is good to see that they're walking and they're being brought, as we speak now, they're meeting with their families, and they're going to soon be brought to hospitals. They will look at them carefully and keep them on the observation for a week to check that everything is okay.
Now, unlike Tal, who is 40, these are 3 very young men. Eliya Cohen is 27. He was captured when he was with his fiancée, Ziv Abud, at the Supernova Desert Rave. She managed to escape and met him today. We saw pictures of him later being on a vehicle with hostage Hirsch Goldberg, Poland, and Or Levi, who was released a few weeks ago, and Alon Ohel, who is still in captivity. Then there's Omer Wenkert, who's 23. He suffers from colitis, which can have just terrible effects if not treated properly. But he too was taken from the Supernova Festival. And then Omer Shem Tov, also taken from the Supernova Festival, and he's only 22. So Manny, why, in your opinion, were these 3 young men released in the first phase?
Like you mentioned, of course, these hostages have various health problems, and that's why they're being released in this stage of the deal rather than the later one. You mentioned Omer with his with colitis. Eliya Cohen was shot during October 7th, so he's was wounded, and Israel had concerns. Of course, anyone who was wounded on October 7th should be released as quickly as possible to be able to treat those injuries. And that's basically what the first phase was, the 33 hostages. It was the women, children, the remaining ones, of course, the elderly, and the infirm. So those who are sick or those who are injured, anyone with underlying health issues that are not being treated correctly in Gaza, that's who is being released in this phase. And the second phase, if that happens, is the remaining hostages those who, of course, are alive, are not suffering from anything unusual beyond, of course, being held in captivity for so long. But Israel wanted to prioritize those who have health problems and get them out first.
And due to their youth, they were paraded on the Hamas stage in these pajama/uniform looking items, kind of to underscore how Hamas treated them as soldiers, or at least potential soldiers. So it's really a miracle to see them walking out so apparently healthy. We'll see how they actually are in the near future. Now, the final release today is set to happen, I believe, while we're recording even. And this is Hisham al-Sayed, who is now 37. And when he was around 28 years old, he's a Bedouin Israeli from the village of Hura in the Negev desert. He entered the strip near the Erez crossing in April 2015. And as I understand it, Manny, this was not the first time that Hisham attempted to enter Gaza. What do you know?
Right. So over the years, according to his family at least, he crossed into Gaza several times and wasn't always stopped by Hamas. He was sent back a couple times, as far as I know from the history. But in April of 2015, I think it was April 20th, if I'm not mistaken, he was detained by Hamas and taken hostage and was not released at all. The only footage Israel saw of him was actually just a couple of years ago in June 2022. Hamas released a video showing him attached to a oxygen mask in Gaza. So Israel has not heard of him since then, and any negotiations to try and release him did not really go anywhere over the years. Like Avera, he is also, according to his family, suffering from a mental illness, and that's why he had been crossing into Gaza. So literally as we were recording, he was handed over to the Red Cross. He's being brought to IDF troops, and he'll of course also be brought out of Gaza. But interestingly enough, with Hisham, Hamas did not carry out a ceremony for his release. They did for the other 5 hostages today, but not for Asayed. Reportedly, Hamas has said or spoken to media and said that this is out of respect for the Arab community in Israel, but of course they wouldn't be holding him captive for a decade if they actually cared. And there's on October 7th, of course, Hamas abducted and murdered several members of the Arab Israeli community. So it's not exactly an excuse that anyone in Israel will buy, but it also just shows that Hamas can release hostages without parading them on a stage in front of a crowd. We see that today with the release of Hisham al-Sayed, but also with last night's handover of the body of Shiri Bibas. And that was also done without any theatrics. So I think we'll see Israel try to pressure the mediators for the next release, which is apparently the bodies of the last 4 remaining hostages in phase 1. Israel will try to ask the mediators to pressure Hamas for them not to carry out this parade on stage like they did with the Bibas family and Oded Lifshitz, because it's of course very disrespectful to the dead.
And that final release of the 4 additional bodies is set for Thursday. We'll go to a short break. And we're back. Now that Hisham has been released in Gaza, Israel is set to release 602 Palestinian prisoners today. And these include 60 serving long sentences, 50 serving life sentences, and 47 who were rearrested after a 2011 exchange for captive IDF soldier Gilad Shalit. Over 100 will be deported upon their release outside the borders of Gaza. Now, in a very Israeli twist, Israel released them wearing a shirt and a bracelet quoting the Psalms. Manny, tell us more about this.
The Israel Prison Service has a bit of a history with doing this now in the hostage releases. I don't think that anyone outside the prison service, and I'm talking about in the Israeli defense establishment, actually supports this. But they kind of do their own thing. So they send them usually with a shirt that says something on it with a threat or something along those lines. We saw last week when Israel released the Palestinian prisoners with these sweatshirts that had a Star of David on it and a threatening message. When these prisoners reached Gaza or the West Bank, they all put them in a pile and set them on fire. I don't think it did very much. It's not exactly anything that helps Israel to do that kind of thing. I mean, I understand that the prison service is sort of trying to humiliate these released terrorists and prisoners, but many in the defense establishment think that Israel shouldn't sort of step down to the level of Hamas, which of course Hamas does these parades and gives the hostages these gift bags with all these sort of memorabilia items and puts these propaganda posters up on stage. I mean, this is horrible to say, but even in the caskets that were returned to Israel with the bodies of the hostages, of the Bibas children and of the Lifshitz, Hamas put propaganda posters inside the coffins as well. So I don't think Israel needs to go to that level, but they've been doing this for several weeks now already, the prison service.
Let's turn to a very disturbing story. And Israel police and the Shin Bet security agency were said on Friday to have detained 2 Jewish Israelis and a Palestinian in connection with explosions on 3 buses in central Israel Thursday night. This happens as the IDF is bolstering operations in the West Bank following what is thought to have been a narrowly averted large-scale terror attack. We discussed this very briefly yesterday on the podcast, and Laser said that the overriding theory is that the timer essentially was set to the wrong end of the day, meaning instead of being AM, it went off during the PM. So, Manny, what else do you know about this and the arrests that were made yesterday?
So that is a very likely theory, but right now, from what we know, the police has placed a gag order on the investigation. So details about the suspects and about the attack itself are a little bit hard to come by, and they're not being published. But there are some bits of information that we've seen so far. From what I've been hearing, is that 3 suspects have been detained, 2 Jewish Israelis and 1 Palestinian. The 2 Jewish Israelis are not detained for carrying out the attack. The perpetrators are still at large, but they allegedly, or are suspected of at least, driving the Palestinians who carried out the attack into Israel or around Israel. There are usually hundreds or even thousands of illegal Palestinians in Israel carrying out work, those without work permits, of course. After October 7th, Israel pretty much cancelled all the work permits. So Israelis sometimes give Palestinians rides to help them into Israel to be able to do work. Sometimes those Palestinians are terrorists planning to carry out an attack. So these 2 Israelis have been detained for allegedly driving them. One of them, I think, is a taxi driver, according to the reports. And the Palestinian was a Palestinian who was in Israel illegally, but it's not clear yet if he actually was one of the perpetrators or maybe he's connected to the attack some other way. But from what we do know is that Israel believes there are multiple perpetrators. The bombs were placed on 4 or 5 buses in the Bat Yam and Holon area, and they were meant to go off simultaneously. Some of them went off, some of them were dismantled. It's a pretty large-scale looking attack with multiple buses and multiple bombs. They were all identical, so there's clearly a network behind this. I would even go as far to say that this is not even something that was planned just by some small local cell. These kind of large-scale attacks usually come with outside influence, if it's from Iran or if it's from Hamas in Turkey or in another country. But of course, I'm not privy to the investigation myself. It's just we've seen with previous kind of bombing attacks like this, usually comes with some outside guidance and funding for the attack. But right now there's an investigation, it's ongoing, and hopefully we'll know more details in the coming days or weeks.
And be allowed to tell them as well.
Of course, yeah.
Manny, thank you so much for joining me today. And really, it's been an emotional roller coaster of a day. We'll have more updates later on our live blog, so please check that out. Manny, have a Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another installment tomorrow. This episode was produced by Adina Karpuch. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, Shalom.